"So you're really going to spend your whole life renting, you useless old man?" Those were the words that cut deeper than any wound for Robert Whitman, a 78-year-old retired construction foreman from Cincinnati. His only son, David, didn't whisper them in private. He spat them out loudly, in front of his wife Linda and their 2 children, Ethan and Maggie, who sat on the living room floor playing with toy cars. Robert didn't shout back. He didn't argue, simply stood, looked at David, kissed his grandchildren on the forehead, and walked out the front door with his old baseball cap in hand. That silent exit marked more than the end of a visit. It was the end of an era line drawn between a father who had given everything and a son who had forgotten it all. For decades, Robert had broken his back on job sites, raising steel and pouring concrete so David would never know the hunger and hardship he once endured. He and his late wife, Margaret, had dreamed of giving their son opportunities they never had. Yet in that moment, every sacrifice felt erased. What David didn't know was that Robert carried a secret. Behind the walls of his modest rented apartment sat a locked briefcase holding deeds, contracts, and investments, proof that the man dismissed as useless was anything but. And with that secret, Robert was about to rewrite his legacy in a way no one in his family could imagine. For most of his life, Robert Whitman believed that sweat, calloused hands, and long days under the sun were the truest way a man could prove his worth. He had started as a laborer, hauling bricks before dawn, and eventually worked his way up to construction foreman. For over 40 years, Robert helped raise schools, bridges, and neighborhoods across Cincinnati. Whenever he drove through the city, he could point at buildings and quietly say to himself, "I helped put that there." His son David never saw those sacrifices the way Robert did. David grew up in a warm home where the pantry was never empty, where birthdays meant cake and presents, and where summers brought road trips across the Midwest. Robert's late wife, Margaret, would often whisper late at night, "Our boy will never know the struggles we had." The thought fueled Robert's determination. He worked overtime, took side jobs, ignored the ache in his knees, just to ensure David's life was different from his own childhood of scarcity. But somewhere along the way, that devotion turned invisible. The more Robert gave, the less David seemed to notice. The tuition paid in full, the down payment for David's first car, even the countless evenings Robert came home bone-tired, but still found the energy to sit on the living room floor building toy cars out of cardboard with his little boy. All of it faded from David's memory. What remained instead was a cold sense of entitlement, as if Robert's sacrifices had been nothing more than expected. That night, after the insult, Robert sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the worn wood grain as if it might answer the questions that tore at his chest. How could the same boy who once held his hand crossing Main Street now call him useless? His mind replayed decades of effort, the extra shifts in winter, the missed holidays, the nights spent patching up work boots so David wouldn't notice how little his father had left for himself. Each memory stung, not because Robert regretted the work, but because it seemed erased in a single sentence. He opened the fridge and grabbed a cold beer, letting the first sip calm the storm inside. The hum of his old radio filled the silence, playing a soft country tune Margaret used to love. For a moment, Robert closed his eyes and imagined her there, reminding him that dignity was something no one could take unless he handed it over. He whispered to the empty room, "Not this time." That was when he reached for the black leather briefcase. It had been sitting at the back of his closet for years, untouched, known only to him. He laid it on the table, brushed off the thin layer of dust, and snapped it open. Inside was not the life of a man who had rented his whole life. It was the life of a man who had built quietly, steadily, and with foresight. There were 14 property deeds, all spread across different corners of the city: apartments, duplexes, and small commercial spaces, each one bringing in steady rent. Alongside them were stacks of investment certificates, contracts, and even shares in a mid-sized real estate company Robert had quietly joined decades earlier. To the outside world, he was just an old foreman living off Social Security and a small pension. But in truth, Robert had built a quiet empire one he never bragged about, because bragging had never been his way. As he thumbed through the papers, Robert felt no rush of pride, only a deep, steady calm. David thinks I've wasted my life. He thought, but I've built more than he'll ever know. And yet, instead of bitterness, what filled him was clarity. The insult had stripped away the last illusion that David would ever see him for who he truly was. And now, Robert knew exactly what to do. He called his old lawyer, Mr. Franklin, first thing the next morning. Franklin had been with him since the early days, helping him buy his first rental house. "I want to make changes," Robert said firmly. "I need everything reviewed, wills, trusts, insurance. And I want my son removed from all of it." Franklin hesitated, his voice heavy with concern. "That's a big step, Robert." "Are you sure?" Robert didn't blink. "I've never been more sure." He crossed the line. "I won't be humiliated again. And I won't leave my legacy in ungrateful hands." The decision wasn't made out of spite, but out of self-respect. After a lifetime of giving, Robert realized it was time to protect what he had built not for David, but for himself, and maybe, just maybe, for others who would know its value. As he left the lawyer's office that afternoon, a crisp fall wind brushed against his face. For the first time in years, Robert felt lighter, as though he had finally set down a burden he'd been carrying in silence. The insult still echoed in his mind, but now it no longer wounded him. Instead, it had ignited something unexpected, the courage to step into a new chapter of his life, one where his worth would no longer depend on his son's approval. And with that thought, Robert headed home not defeated, but determined. With a secret that was about to change everything, Robert didn't slam the door when he left his son's house. He didn't raise his voice or demand respect. He simply tipped his old baseball cap, kissed his grandkids on the forehead, and walked out into the cool Ohio evening. That silence carried more weight than any argument could have. He knew David wouldn't notice it in the moment, but one day, he might remember the last time he saw his father's back disappearing down the driveway as he drove home to his small rented apartment. Robert replayed the scene in his mind. The sting of being called useless by his own son burned, but beneath the hurt, a surprising calm settled in. For years he had tolerated small jabs, dismissive comments, moments where he felt invisible at family gatherings. But this time, something inside him shifted. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. He wasn't going to spend the rest of his life begging for respect in a house where he was treated as a burden. That night, sitting at his kitchen table, Robert poured himself a cup of black coffee instead of reaching for the beer. He needed his mind sharp, not clouded. The radio played an old Willie Nelson tune, and as the melody filled the room, Robert thought about his late wife, Margaret. She had always been his anchor. "Don't let anyone tell you what you're worth," she used to say when he came home. Beaten down by work politics or contractors trying to short him, her voice echoed in his head, steady and sure. The more he thought about it, the more Robert realized the insult wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. For 78 years he had worked, saved, and quietly built a life most people around him didn't even know existed. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Not to prove David wrong, Robert didn't need that, but to remind himself of the dignity he had earned. The next morning, he dug into the back of his closet and pulled out the old black leather briefcase he hadn't opened in years. The brass locks clicked open, and there it was, decades of effort condensed into papers and contracts. Deeds for 14 properties, bank records, insurance policies, and certificates from the real estate company he'd quietly invested in when most men his age were thinking about slowing down. He smiled, not out of pride, but out of relief. The life he had built in silence was still solid, still his. With the briefcase open on the table, Robert made a decision. He wasn't going to let bitterness guide him, but he also wasn't going to allow ingratitude to drain him anymore. He would protect what was his, not by confrontation, but by action. That same week, Robert called his longtime lawyer, Mr. Franklin, and set up an appointment. The two men had known each other since the late 70s, when Franklin helped Robert buy his first duplex. "I want to make some changes," Robert told him. "Wills, insurance, all of it. And I need my son's name removed completely." Looked across the desk, adjusting his glasses. "Robert, that's a big step. Are you sure?" Robert leaned forward. His voice was calm, but firm. "I'm done waiting for respect that's never coming. My son crossed a line. This isn't about revenge. It's about dignity." Franklin nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what was being said. Together, they spent hours going through paperwork, property by property, account by account. By the end of the week, David had been quietly written out of everything. No inheritance, no access, not even medical coverage Robert had once kept for him. It was all erased with signatures and legal seals, no shouting, no courtroom battles, just steady, deliberate decisions. Walking out of Franklin's office that Friday afternoon, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years: lightness. The fall air was crisp, the leaves along the street turning shades of gold and red. He breathed deeply and realized he wasn't carrying the weight of disappointment anymore. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't defined by what David thought of him. He wasn't an old man renting an apartment. He was Robert Whitman, a man who had built a quiet fortune with his own two hands, a man who still had purpose left in him. And as he walked toward his truck, briefcase in hand, he felt the faintest spark of excitement. Something was ending, yes, but something new was just beginning. Robert sat at his kitchen table with the black leather briefcase open in front of him. Papers were spread across the wood like puzzle pieces of a life no one suspected he had lived. Each deed carried memories, some joyful, some heavy. He ran his finger over the faded ink of the very first property he had purchased, a small duplex near the river. Back then, he hadn't had much more than grit and a willingness to gamble on himself. Now, decades later, the gamble had paid off. He leaned back in his chair, the light from the old lamp casting long shadows across the room. For years, people saw only the surface: a tired man in worn boots, living in a modest apartment, sipping coffee at the corner diner. They never knew about the careful savings, the deals struck after long days on the job, the nights spent repairing broken pipes in rental units when most men his age were resting. Robert never bragged about it, not even to Margaret. She had known he was setting something aside, but she never pressed for details. That was their unspoken bond. She trusted his judgment, and he worked silently for both of them. Now, with Margaret gone, those papers were more than contracts. They were proof of a lifetime of endurance, of choices made in silence when the world wasn't watching. To David, he had been nothing but an aging tenant paying monthly rent. To Robert, he was the quiet owner of 14 properties, each one a brick in the legacy he had built. He picked up a ring of old keys from the bottom of the briefcase. They jingled with weight, the kind of sound only landlords and janitors knew well. Robert closed his eyes and memories came rushing back. The little ranch-style house on Oakwood Drive, that was where he carried Margaret over the threshold as newlyweds. The duplex on Elm Street, that was where he spent his first Christmas as a landlord, fixing a furnace in the middle of the night so a young family wouldn't freeze. In the corner grocery building, he remembered signing the papers. With sweaty palms, terrified he was making a mistake. Each property wasn't just income. It was a chapter of his story. But now, he saw them differently. These weren't trophies. They weren't leverage to win back David's respect. They were tools he could still use, even at 78. To make sure his life had meaning beyond his son's rejection, as Robert gathered the documents into neat piles, realized he needed more than a lawyer to handle these decisions. He needed to decide what came next. Selling everything would make him rich on paper, but money wasn't the point. Money had never been the point. What mattered was leaving behind something that couldn't be erased by an insult. That thought stayed with him the next morning as he drove across town to check on one of the older properties he hadn't visited in years. The building was a weathered brick fourplex, tucked behind a line of maple trees. He parked across the street and sat for a long while, watching tenants come and go. A young mother carried groceries upstairs, 2 little boys chasing after her. An older man sat on the porch reading the paper. Nobody glanced his way. To them, he was just another passerby. Robert felt a surprising sense of comfort in that anonymity. He had spent so many years being invisible in his own family, but here, it wasn't rejection, it was freedom. He could see life unfold without anyone knowing he was the one who kept the lights on, who paid for the roof repairs, who fixed the plumbing, and maybe that was enough. Maybe his purpose wasn't to be recognized, but to keep building quietly, leaving his mark in ways people might never realize. Driving back, Robert began to picture something bigger. What if all those years of saving and investing weren't just for rental checks and inheritance papers? What if he used them to create something that mattered now while he was still alive to see it? The thought startled him with its clarity. He didn't need David's approval. He didn't even need his name remembered. What he needed was to use what he had, every property, every dollar, to prove, first to himself and then to the world, that dignity doesn't fade with age. That night, as the autumn wind rattled the windows of his apartment, Robert closed the briefcase, slid it back under his armchair, and whispered softly into the silence, "It's time." He didn't know exactly what form his plan would take yet, but he knew this: his life wasn't winding down. It was just taking a new shape, one that would honor everything he and Margaret had fought for. For the first time in months, Robert slept peacefully. The insult still lingered, but it no longer wounded him. It had become something else entirely, a spark, pushing him toward a future that even his son could never diminish. The following Monday, Robert walked into Mr. Franklin's law office, briefcase in hand. The room hadn't changed in decades: dark oak shelves, framed diplomas, the faint smell of leather and old paper. Franklin, a man Robert had known since his 30s, looked up over his glasses and gave him a steady smile. "Haven't seen you in a while, Robert. What brings you in today?" Robert set the briefcase on the desk, flipped it open, and let the papers speak for themselves. "It's time," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Franklin scanned the deeds, the contracts, the notes Robert had scribbled in the margins. After a long pause, he leaned back in his chair. "You've built more than most men I know. What do you want to do with it?" That was the moment Robert had been turning over in his mind since the night of the insult. He folded his hands, choosing his words carefully. "I want everything reviewed: wills, trusts, insurance, powers of attorney. And I want David's name off all of it. Every line, every signature." The lawyer studied him. "It's not a small decision, Robert. Are you?" "Sure." Robert looked out the office window at the busy street below, people rushing with coffee cups and briefcases. For 78 years he had been sure of one thing: his duty to his family. But now he felt something different: clarity. "I'm done leaving doors open for someone who disrespects me. This isn't revenge, Franklin. It's protection. It's dignity." So they got to work. The next few days were a blur of meetings and signatures. He combed through old contracts, updated deeds, and secured accounts with new authorizations. Franklin made phone calls while Robert sat across the desk, sipping coffee and answering questions with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this moment all his life. One by one, ties were cut. David's name disappeared from the will. His access to medical benefits was revoked. Old power of attorney documents were shredded. It wasn't done with anger or spite. It was done with quiet resolve, the way a man locks the door not out of hatred for who's outside, but to keep his home safe. By the end of the week, Franklin handed Robert a neat folder. "Everything is in order," he said. "If something ever happens to you, your son won't be able to touch a cent. You've built a wall he can't climb." Robert placed the folder back into his briefcase and gave the lawyer a firm handshake. "Thank you. You've done more than paperwork today. You've given me peace." Walking out of the office into the crisp fall air, Robert felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of disappointment was still there, but now it sat differently, like a scar instead of an open wound. He knew David would keep calling, pretending nothing had happened, sending messages as if the insult had been erased by time. But Robert also knew he didn't have to answer. Silence could speak louder than any reply. That evening, he took a long walk through his neighborhood. The leaves crunched under his boots, and the cool breeze carried the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. He passed houses where porch lights glowed and families gathered around dinner tables. He didn't feel bitter, didn't feel envious. What he felt was determination, because he knew his story wasn't over. He had secured his legacy. Yes, but now the question was, what was he going to do with it? All that property, all that planning, all those quiet sacrifices, they weren't meant to sit in drawers or gather dust in filing cabinets. They were meant to be used to build something that mattered. For the first time in years, Robert felt the stirrings of excitement. It's not the kind of excitement that comes from youth or ambition, but the deeper kind of sense of purpose. He thought of Margaret, her voice reminding him that worth isn't measured in applause, but in what you leave behind. And he thought of every older neighbor he had seen sitting alone on their porch, every widower at the diner staring into his coffee, every woman in church who looked like she carried 1,000 unspoken stories. That night, as he sat by the window, with the briefcase at his feet, Robert whispered softly to himself, "It's not enough to protect what I have. I need to use it. I need to give it shape." And though he didn't know exactly how yet, he could feel it coming, an idea that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others who had been made to feel invisible. After the legal work was finished, Robert returned home each night with a sense of relief. He had locked every door David once had access to, and for the first time in years, he slept without worrying who might try to take advantage of him. But as the days passed, he realized that simply protecting what he owned wasn't enough. It was like building a fortress around himself, safe, yes, but empty. One chilly October morning, he sat by his kitchen window with a steaming mug of coffee, watching kids run to catch the school bus. He remembered when David was that age, when Margaret would pack his lunch and wave from the porch. The memory should have brought warmth, but instead it felt hollow. He whispered aloud, almost like Margaret was still there to hear him. "What good is all this if it just sits in folders? What good is it if it dies with me?" That thought followed him through the week. On Wednesday, he drove out to check on one of his older rental properties, a worn-out brick house on the east side. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown. But as he stood there, leaning on his truck, a thought struck him. This could be more than just a house. This could be a place for someone to start again. It was a spark, small, but enough to ignite something bigger. Robert began to imagine not just one house, but a place where older folks like him could gather. Not to be warehoused or forgotten, but to live, to share, to teach. A place that wasn't about care, but about community. That night, Robert pulled out a yellow legal pad and began sketching ideas. His handwriting was large and deliberate, each word written like it carried weight. Garden with benches, workshop for carpentry. Library with old records and books. Kitchen big enough for Sunday meals. He wasn't an architect, but he knew how to build from the ground up. He'd done it his whole life. This time, though, the blueprint wasn't for walls, and BeamSit was for dignity. Still, he knew he couldn't do it alone. The next day, he called Tom Alvarez, an old colleague who'd retired from city planning. They hadn't spoken in years. But Tom's voice was as steady as ever. After listening carefully, Tom said, "Robert, this isn't just a project. This could be your legacy." The word hit Robert harder than he expected. Legacy. For months, he had been defined by what David said useless, but now someone was offering a different definition. Not a burden, not forgotten. Builder even in his later years. They met at a diner on Main Street the following week, spreading out napkins and sketching rough layouts between cups of coffee. Tom pointed out zoning issues. Robert countered with practical solutions. Before long, other familiar faces joined them, an old carpenter, who still had his tools. A retired teacher eager to start a book club, even a widow from Robert's church, who offered to cook meals for whoever came through the doors. Piece by piece, the vision started to take shape. It wasn't just Robert's dream anymore, it was theirs too. And that gave him a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. But there was something else unexpected. As he shared his plans, people didn't look at him like an old man chasing a fantasy. They looked at him with respect. They asked for his advice, leaned in when he spoke, called him Mr. Whitman with genuine regard. For a man who had been dismissed in his own son's living room, this was no small thing. It was a quiet redemption. One evening, after a long meeting with Tom, Robert returned home exhausted but content. He sat down in his recliner, staring at the briefcase that still held his deeds and contracts. He realized those papers were no longer just assets to guard. They were seeds. And seeds were meant to be planted. He smiled to himself, almost hearing Margaret's voice again. "See, Robert? You were never useless. You were just waiting for the right moment to show what you built." And in that moment, Robert knew his story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about creation, about turning pain into purpose, and proving, not with words, but with bricks and mortar, that even at 78, he still had something left to give. The first time Robert walked into the old warehouse that would soon become his senior center, the place smelled of dust and rusted metal. The floorboards creaked, the roof leaked in places, and a family of pigeons had made a home in the rafters. Most people would have shaken their heads and walked away, but Robert stood in the middle of that empty space, ran his hand across the peeling paint of the wall, and thought, "This is it. This is where something new begins." At first, it was just him and Tom Alvarez, the retired city planner. Spent hours sweeping floors, pulling out nails, and patching holes. It was exhausting work for two men in their late 70s, but Robert felt alive again. For the first time in years, he wasn't just passing the time, he was building something. And that feeling of purpose was worth every ache in his back. Word started to spread around town. A retired teacher named Mrs. Carter showed up one morning with a stack of donated books and said she'd love to set up a small library. A Vietnam veteran, Bill Harris, brought in a set of old tools and offered to run woodworking workshops. Even a widow from Robert's church, Elaine Turner, volunteered to cook hot meals every Sunday. None of them were related to Robert by blood, but each one treated him like the head of something bigger than a project. It was strange, almost unsettling at first. Robert had spent so many years feeling invisible in his own family. Now, suddenly, strangers were looking at him with respect, calling him Mr. Whitman, asking his opinion before making decisions. He hadn't realized how much he missed, being valued until it returned, not from his son, but from people who chose to see him. As the weeks went on, the center started to take shape. Walls were painted bright colors, donated chairs filled the main hall, and a garden patch was dug out. Back where neighbors planted tomatoes and green beans, every hammer strike, every brush of paint felt like another stitch pulling Robert back into the fabric of community. One afternoon, while they were planting flowers along the walkway, Elaine wiped the dirt from her hands and said softly, "Robert, you know, you've started more than a project here, right? You've started a family." The words hit him harder than he expected. Family. For months, that word had been a wound. He thought of David, of the insult, of the silence that followed. Yet here was a group of people, widows, veterans, retirees, none of them tied to him by blood, yet bound to him by something deeper, shared purpose. It was in those quiet moments that Robert began to understand. Family isn't just who you raise, it's who stands beside you when you're no longer strong enough to stand alone. Still, there were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan in his apartment, wondering if he was fooling himself. Could these new bonds really replace the love he had once expected from his own son? But each morning, when he walked into that center and heard the laughter, saw the smiles, and felt the gratitude in people's eyes, the doubts grew smaller. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the volunteers headed home, Robert sat on the front steps of the center, watching the sky turn pink and gold. Bill handed him a cup of coffee and sat beside him. "You know," Bill said, "I've been coming here a month, and it already feels more like home than the house I've lived in for 20 years. You gave me that." Robert didn't reply right away. His throat tightened, and he had to blink away the sting in his eyes. All he could manage was a quiet "thank you." Because sometimes gratitude doesn't need long speeches. It just needs to be felt. That night, as he locked up the center and walked back to his truck, Robert realized something. He wasn't chasing his son's respect anymore. He wasn't. Waiting for David's approval, he'd found something better. A new kind of family. One he never expected. One that chose him for who he was. Not for what he could give. And for the first time in a long time, Robert Whitman drove home not as a man carrying rejection, but as a man carrying belonging. It happened on an ordinary Saturday. It's a kind of day when Robert usually walked through the garden beds behind the senior center, checking the tomato vines and pulling a few weeds. He was bent over, tying up a stalk with twine, when he felt a presence nearby. Looking up, he saw a tall, lanky teenager standing awkwardly by the gate, clutching the straps of his backpack. It took Robert a moment to recognize him. It was Ethan, his oldest grandson. The boy gave a shy wave, his eyes darting between the ground and his grandfather. "Hi, Grandpa," he said softly, almost like he was afraid the word wouldn't be welcome. Robert wiped the dirt from his hands and walked over slowly. His heart was pounding harder than it had in years. He hadn't seen Ethan since the day in David's living room when the insult was thrown. He braced himself, unsure if this was another cruel game orchestrated by his son. But then Ethan spoke. Again. "Dad doesn't know I'm here. Mom told me what you've been building and I—" Asterisk for a moment. Robert couldn't find words, simply placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and reassuring, then led him inside. The center was buzzing with quiet activity. Bill was sanding down an old chair Mrs. Carter was setting out books on a shelf, and a group of widows were arranging flowers in mason jars for the tables. Ethan's eyes widened as he took it all in. "You made this?" he asked in disbelief. Robert chuckled. "Not alone. Took a lot of good folks to get here, but yes, this was my idea." Ethan walked slowly through the rooms, running his hands across the smooth wood of the tables, peeking into the library, pausing by the garden window. He didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was curious, searching. Finally, he turned to his grandfather and said, almost in a whisper, "I'm proud of you, Grandpa." The words hit Robert like a tide. For months, he had built this place without expecting recognition, without waiting for his son to notice. Yet here it was. From the lips of his grandson, the affirmation he never thought he would hear again. They spent the rest of the afternoon together. Ethan asked questions about construction, about how to lay bricks straight, about how Robert had started in the business. Robert answered patiently, showing him small tricks of the trade, handing him tools just as he once had with David. Decades earlier, it was as if time had folded back on itself, giving him another chance to pass something down. When evening came, Ethan said he had to leave, adjusted his backpack and looked almost guilty. "Dad wouldn't understand if he knew I came. But I'll come back if that's okay." Robert pulled him into a brief, firm hug. "Anytime, son. You don't need permission to see your grandfather." True to his word, Ethan returned the following weekend. This time, he brought his younger sister Maggie, a bright-eyed girl, with a sketchbook tucked under her arm, while Ethan helped with the woodworking. Maggie sat with the widows and drew pictures of flowers, proudly taping them to the walls. The center lit up with their presence. Week by week, the bond deepened. Robert never pushed them to talk about David, never demanded explanations. He simply welcomed them, let them help, and offered the kind of quiet guidance he knew teenagers secretly craved. For the first time in years, he felt not just like a man with a mission, but like a grandfather again. One Sunday evening, after they'd finished stacking chairs, Maggie slipped a folded paper into his hand. "I made this for you," she said shyly. When Robert unfolded it, he saw a drawing of the senior center with the words, "Grandpa's House of Hope," written in bright colors across the roof. Robert's throat tightened, placed the paper gently against his chest, and looked at his grandchildren with misty eyes. He didn't need to say much, just whispered, "Thank you," because sometimes the simplest words hold the deepest meaning. As he locked the doors that night, Robert realized something important. His relationship with David might never heal, but life had given him another chance through these two young souls. And maybe that was enough. In the laughter of his grandchildren, in their pride and curiosity, Robert found the redemption he had been denied. The senior center had been open for only a few months, but it was already alive with the sound of voices and laughter. Every day seemed to bring someone new through the doors, an old veteran looking for company, a widow who had grown tired of eating alone, or a retired couple who just wanted a place where people still remembered how to listen. Robert never hung a sign that bore his name. He didn't need the credit. For him, the center was about giving people a place to feel seen. One chilly afternoon, Robert was showing Ethan how to patch a wooden bench. A man in a pressed suit walked in, carrying a camera bag and a notebook. He introduced himself as Mark Reynolds, a local newspaper journalist. "Mr. Whitman," he said, "I've been hearing about this place all over town. Folks keep telling me there's something special happening here." Robert frowned a little, instinctively uncomfortable with attention. "This isn't a story about me," he said, dusting off his hands. "It's about them, the people who come here." But Mark was persistent. He watched the room quietly, taking notes as seniors played cards at one table. A group of widows planned a potluck at another, and Maggie taped her drawings on the wall. "With all respect, sir, I think people need to know this story. Too often. The elderly are treated like they've already had their time. What you're doing here proves that isn't true." Reluctantly, Robert agreed to a short interview on one condition. No glamour, no exaggeration. "Just tell the truth," he said. "This is a place where dignity lives. It's nothing more, nothing less." A week later, the article appeared in the Cincinnati Herald. The headline read, "A House of Heritage. One man's mission to give seniors a place to belong." There was no flashy photo of Robert on the front page, only a picture of a long wooden table filled with smiling faces. At the very bottom, his name appeared in small print, almost as an afterthought. Robert expected the piece to come and go without much notice. But he underestimated how hungry people were for a story of hope. Within days, neighbors he had never met stopped him on the street, shaking his hand and thanking him. Donations of books, tools, and furniture began arriving at the center's doors. Local high school students volunteered to help in the garden after classes. A nearby church offered to host Sunday dinners once a month. The center swelled with new life. Where once Robert worried the rooms might sit empty, now he worried about finding enough chairs. It was a good problem to have, though he never asked for recognition. He couldn't deny the warmth he felt when people looked him in the eye and called him the man who gave us a home. One evening, after a long day of activity, Robert locked up the front door and sat on the steps with a cup of coffee. Bill, the veteran, sat beside him.
"You know, Bill said—"
"I read that article 3 times. Not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't say. It didn't say how lonely I used to feel before this place. It didn't say how my nights don't feel as long anymore. But I know that's because of you." Robert swallowed hard, staring at the fading sunset. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. Deep down, he knew that was the real recognition, seeing the light come back into someone's eyes. What surprised him most was how his grandchildren reacted. Ethan brought a copy of the newspaper to school, proudly showing his friends. Maggie carefully clipped the article and tucked it into her sketchbook, as if it were a treasure. They didn't care that the headline wasn't about them. They just wanted to tell the world, "That's my grandpa." For Robert, that was more than enough. The public applause didn't matter. What mattered was that the people who once looked at him with pity or dismissal now saw him as something else entirely. Not a man at the end of his life, but a man still building, still giving. That night, as he placed the folded newspaper on his nightstand, Robert smiled to himself. He hadn't sought recognition, but somehow it had found him. And maybe, just maybe, that was life's way of telling him that his work was only beginning. The recognition from the community was humbling. But Robert never let it go to his head. Each morning, he still brewed his coffee the same way, still walked the garden, rose at the center, still checked the hinges on doors and tightened loose screws, like the foreman he once was. He had spent a lifetime keeping things standing, and now at 17-9, he realized the greatest structure he had ever built didn't have concrete or steel. It was made of people. The senior center had become more than a gathering place. It was a refuge. A widower named George said it was the only reason he bothered getting out of bed. A woman named Clara, who had been all but abandoned by her children, found joy teaching the younger volunteers how to quilt. And Robert's grandchildren, Ethan and Maggie, came almost every weekend, eager to help serve meals or paint walls. Watching them laugh with the older folks made Robert feel something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, but perhaps the most powerful moment came quietly one evening. Robert was locking up when he found a folded note slipped under the door. In shaky handwriting it read, "Thank you for giving me a reason to live one more day. A friend you haven't met." Robert stood there in the dim light of the hallway, holding that note like it was made of glass. He realized then that the center wasn't just healing others, it was healing him. Jew? For so long he had carried the sting of David's words. He had replayed them over and over in his head, wondering how a father and son could drift so far apart. But as the months passed, and as the rooms of the center filled with laughter and music, the bitterness began to fade. Understood now that his worth had never depended on David's approval. His worth had always been written in the lives he touched, even in ways he didn't see. One Sunday after service, Robert sat with Maggie in the garden. She handed him a small notebook she'd been writing in. "Grandpa," she said shyly, "I've been writing down stories people tell me here. Little things like how Bill taught me to sand wood, or how Mrs. Carter showed me how to make peach cobbler. I don't want to forget them." Robert flipped through the pages, his eyes stinging with tears. "You're doing exactly what matters, sweetheart. You're keeping their voices alive." And in that moment, he realized his true legacy wasn't the buildings, the deeds, or even the center itself. It was memory. It was the passing down of dignity from one generation to the next. That night, he wrote in his own journal, "Dignity is not something people hand you. It's something you carry, even when others refuse to see it. And if you live with it long enough, it becomes a gift you leave behind." The center grew, and so did Robert's peace. David never returned, but Robert no longer waited for him. He had stopped chasing the love that wasn't offered and started embracing the love that was freely given. The insult that once broke him had, in a strange way, rebuilt him into a man more whole than before. Friends, if there's one thing I've learned from Robert's story, it's this: your value is not defined by those who fail to see it. Sometimes even family can hurt us the deepest, but that doesn't erase who we are. Dignity is something we protect, something we live out in every act of kindness, every choice to keep going when the world says stop. And here's the truth: when you choose to live with dignity, you don't just heal yourself. You become a light for others who thought they were invisible. Now I want to hear from you. Has there ever been a time when someone made you feel small, and you had to remind yourself of your own worth? Share your story in the comments, I promise. Someone else out there needs to read it. And if Robert's journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Together, we'll keep sharing stories that remind us all, no matter our age. Our dignity, our value, and our legacy are never lost.